Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the third of three shows today. And then I'm not back again now till the 9th when we're looking at Lafayette, some various airborne things, more Omaha stuff coming up. Anyway, Charles Herrick's U.S. Army career took him from West Point to the Pentagon. He mastered parachutist along the way, Ranger tab, etc., etc. But in recent years, he's began the exhaustive task of analyzing the famous Robert Capa Omaha photos that everybody knows. His book, Back into Focus, is in the links below. You can find it at your favorite bookstore. Here's my copy here. And it's one of those books that is going straight into my list of essential books to understand the Omaha beach landings. And in some ways, as you know, we've dug down here, kind of the mythology about Omaha Beach. Where did these ideas begin that we then have used generationally since that 1944 to explain Omaha Beach? Anyway, I'll bring him in now. So good afternoon or morning, sir. How are you today?
Very well. How about yourself?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. So I mean, I've been really looking forward to this one because, you know, living in Normandy, going to Omaha Beach, the Robert Capa photos loom large. They loom large in the historiography, in just the imagery, in just everything that regards Omaha Beach. So before we get into your photos and your presentation and what have you, just explain to us how you went from your career to focusing on these famous images from that day.
Well, I'm one of those closet history nerds who spends his time in the basement doing a lot of reading and
yeah, welcome to the club.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it initially research. It was just reading for my own sake. But Alan Capa had Alan Coleman has a website called Nearby Cafe, and he's a leading photo critic. And he and Ross Bauman, he was the youngest Pulitzer Prize winning photographer, and they'd gotten together and they decided to question the truth behind the lab accident story with Capa. The lab accident story holds that when his film got back to London, most of the film was ruined in a drying cabinet, and they very quickly realized there's some problems, technical problems with that. Another great photographer, Rob McElroy, joined their team, and eventually another one called Christian DeCuna. And they decisively proved that the lab accident just was not technically feasible. Something else had to have happened with the film. And I kind of got involved in them just from a point of view of helping interpret the military aspects of what they see in the photos. And from there, it just kind of grew out of control until it ended up with the book.
As all good history projects do, they end up becoming massive. So we'll bring up the slides now, and folks, I think you're going to sit back and just learn a lot on here, but of course, if you do have questions, just fire away and we'll address them there. But Robert Capa, you know, I mean, when we talk about the photojournalists and the reporters and the correspondents, well, they, to some extent, Chuck, they all have a bit of showbiz about them. That's why they are in the environment they are. They know how to play the game. They know what sells, and for most people who are aware of Robert Capa, they're also aware of this famous, their famous story. So I'll hand it back to you. This is kind of begins to examine the legend of what he said and the reality being sometimes a little bit far apart.
Yeah, he was a struggling young photographer, and he and his girlfriend Gerda, he was born Andre Friedman, and Capa was just an invention. And a rich American photographer, and Capa was posing as he was actually taking the photos, but pretending he was the darkroom guy, and Gerda would sell the photos to the editors. But soon, Capa actually ended up assuming the identity of Andre Freeman assumed the identity of Capa, and their first big break was they were sent down to cover the Spanish Civil War, and Capa had spent all of his life with extreme socialist causes and organizations, and he was, basically communist adjacent, I guess you'd put it, during his most of his life. So he ended up following a communist militia called the PLUM while he was in Spain. And one of those times, he was covering the battles in the area of Cerro Murano. And it was there that supposedly these pictures were taken, and they were taken of the Pune militia as they were doing an attack. And I'm going to read exactly how he described it, because it really bears on I won't call it the deception, but how these things were falsely portrayed. And this is a quote from his interview. The men, the militia, fired towards the machine gun for 5 minutes. Then they stood up and said, "Vamos, let's go," and crawled out of the trench and advanced towards the machine gun. Sure enough, the machine gun opened up and dim, dim. So what was left of them came back and again take pot shots in the direction of the machine gun. That certainly was clever enough not to answer. And after 5 minutes again, they say, "Vamos," and they got mowed down again. This thing repeated itself for about 3 or 4 times. So the 4th time, I just kind of put my camera above my head and didn't even look and clicked a picture when they moved over the trench. And that was supposedly the setting of how he took this picture. Wasn't looking, camera's just up over his head, blindly taking the shot, and he happened to capture this guy at the precise moment of his death. Well, these were originally printed in View magazine in Europe. And they actually printed 2 photos. And it shows 2 different guys being shot at the exact same location, exact same spot in the ground. I mean, if you blow them up, you can even see the same stalks of grass between their legs. Cameras tilted a little bit different, but it's the idea that he could have taken 2 of these photos blindly with his camera above his head, not looking through the viewfinder, and that somehow one of the guys magically disappeared out of the scene. It was pretty much a clue to anybody who wanted to question these things that this was not what it appeared to be. The mere fact that the photographer is in front of charging troops in combat is always a giveaway. It's not quite a realistic photo. So now this particular page comes from an article by Professor Spirigi. I'm sure I'm butchering the name, I apologize, from the University of the Basque. He decided he'd go ahead and try to locate where these photos were taken. And if you move on to the next slide, he ended up precisely geolocating the photos. Now, he started out at Cerro Muriano and quickly realized that the terrain does not match it at all. So they ended up precisely geolocating it down to Espejo, which is down the bottom. So these photos of combat actually took place 30 miles behind the lines. So as of 2008, I mean, it's been definitively proven that these photos were staged, faked. Capa was basically a partisan propagandist for this unit.
And if there's a cop watching, this is immediately giving the suggestion that Capa, for all his brilliance in terms of being an artist and getting some of these incredible images in different circumstances we're explaining, is not necessarily the most reliable detailist of what he did. He's prone to exaggeration, embellishment, etc., etc. It's worth noting, folks, as we go on with this, that's why Chuck did this story. It sets a bit of a precedent, I think, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, he was 23 years old at the time, 23 or 24. He was really living in poverty until this came out, and suddenly he's vaulted into public acclaim, international renown. And I'm sure that he, at least unintentionally, came away with the idea of, look, if you sex up your photos a little bit, whether it's context or whatever, they sell better. And he did. He was one of the great storytellers. I mean, he was a raconteur of the first class, and every story he told, he embellished for one way or another. And that
which brings us to these images that you're going to explain. So that was the introduction done, folks. So yeah, who's not seen that photo? Nobody. So again, back to you.
Yeah. As he told the story, he landed with Company E of the 16th Infantry Regiment on the eastern half of Omaha Beach, and they ended up, almost all of them, landing on the Fox Red Beach sector. And said he landed at H hour. But this is a photo, one of 5 that he took from the ramp of his landing craft. And as you can see, his photo kind of puts the lie to his story. The tide in the photo is within about, I don't know, 50 to 25 yards of the shingle. The shingle was a berm at the high water level part of the beach. And you see it in the background there. There's one layer that's dark, and those are small rocks. And above that's another about 7 feet high, a bank of sand above it. Well, the tide here is almost all the way to the embankment. Well, at 6:30, when Capa said he landed, the tide was still a good 250 yards seaward of the obstacles. So that's a dead giveaway clue that he did not land when he said he did. In fact, he landed in the same wave as a regimental commander. In fact, in the same boat as the regimental commander. And they were doing it 08:05, a little over an hour and a half after HR. But the regimental commander saw nothing but chaos on the beach, and he motored down until he found a place that he'd land in, and he found this spot. So they landed at 8:20, maybe 8:15, depending on the three people's watches that recorded it.
Yeah,
it's an interesting scene though, because there's a lot of key things in it. You see, first of all, in the center right, 2 duplex drive tanks. One of them's turned flank onto us with a life preserver on it. And you can tell they're duplex drive because they've got the screens are partially inflated. And then you've got the little square chimney-like thing coming out of them. That was to get the exhaust out of the bathtub. So there are 2 of those there. And as you recall, on this half of Omaha Beach, of the 32 duplex drive tanks, all but 5 sank. So these are 2 of the very few that made it in.
Yeah.
And you also see 3 other tanks. 2 of them are deep wading kit standard tanks. And then to the left, you have another deep wading kit tank with big 10 on it. And that's the bulldozer that landed. So these 3 tanks landed in wave 2. And they were part of the Gap Assault Team 10 that landed here. And blew some gaps in the obstacles at this point. Now, this is probably the best looking of Capa's 5 shots from the ramp. The others are tend to be ill-focused, blurred, and whatnot. Now, whether Capa was doing that because he had a philosophy that if you want a good action shot, you had to move the camera to get some blur on it, or whether he was actually just scared to death, which I'm sure was a factor here as well. We don't know, but this is the best look of it. The rest of them have that blurred, shaky Blair Witch Project kind of image that really gives kind of a false context to the environment at the time. In when Capa landed, his wave had about 120 people in it, and not a single person, not a single casualty getting up to the beach. So the defenses of that location were not nearly as bad as they were at many others. Once he was on the beach, he had only 5 frames left in his camera, and he took these 5 photos, and 2 of them were pictures of this group of engineers, but they've been portrayed throughout history as GIs pinned down on the surf. And of course, they're not actually hiding behind the obstacles. You can see that they're all around it in different configurations. And if you take a closer look, go to the next slide, if you would, please. Okay, this analyzes it. Now, I'd like to say I came up with all these observations, but I didn't. I recall back on a message board in early 2000s, somebody else had put this up there, and very keen observations. First one is in the rectangular boxes, you see lines there, and that's actually permacord, which is an early form of detonation cord. And the engineers would run that between charges on obstacles so that they could detonate all the charges at once. Now, speaking of engineers, you can tell that this group is largely made up of engineers by the markings on the helmets. That little arc was the standard ETO helmet marking protocol for engineers. And so these are probably the Army engineers of Gap Assault Team 10. And they're all gathered around there. So they're obviously doing something to do with their engineer task, which is to blow obstacles. We see the dead cord there. So it appears to me that they're probably rigging that. And a couple other photos, you see some of their charges actually in place on the obstacles. In the
We were
background, you
talking
see,
earlier. Sorry to interrupt you. We were talking earlier before we went live about when these photos in some ways were first printed, Life magazine and journals, is that the quality wasn't very good, and so you could just put a caption that said GIs and no one would be able to tell anything. But now, as we have them at better resolution and better investigative skills, and we can now see things like the markings on the helmet and the things in the beach there. So which means it's unmasking some of the details at simple quality.
yes,
Prevented people seeing. So the captions could just be, GIs on the beach taking cover, and no one will be any the wiser. Now, we were talking about Michael Ackerman before going live. People like Mike are just doing that work where they zoom in and go, hang on, you can see that guy's got a certain patch on his shoulder, and that identifies him as being. And we're in a revolution of the understanding of the photos now. So yeah.
When they were first transmitted, they were sent by radio telephoto, which provide some pretty lousy resolution, and a normal newspaper resolution was not much better either. So they really look poor in a lot of the initial newspapers that came out and made the first splash.
Whoops. You want to go 8 next, don't you? Yeah.
Let's do this one next. Yeah. This is another set of 2 photos that he took, and he's looking kind of diagonally down the beach, and this shows the obstacles that haven't been blown in this area, and that's kind of a good contrast of what a good job Gap Assault Team 10 had done. There were 2 photos, and both of them, the narrative has always been, again, GIs pinned down on the beach, and there are a bunch of troops hunkered down around obstacles. Some of them may be engineers, but there's more than that, and there's an MP there as well. So these are probably the troops that came from the LCM that was right next to Capa's landing craft. But the key point is, in the center of the photo, you've got 2 guys upright, calmly walking down the beach. And that tells you that whatever reason these guys have gotten down behind cover, it's not because they're necessarily pinned down. And we're going to go into that more in a little bit. That when Life published these, they didn't use this image. They used the other image, the second image in this series, where the guys are further down the beach, and the way Life published it, those guys weren't there. So the editorial selection had aided the impression that they were trying to make of guys pinned down on the beach and how horrible it was, which was very true in other parts of the beach, just not necessarily right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I want to stress that Capa's area was lightly defended, but it was actually hell on earth in so much of the rest of the beach there.
So back to 7 now, on to 9. Back to 7?
Yeah, back to 7. So this is the famous face in the surf photo. We don't know what agony this man here is suffering, whether he just fell, whether he's wounded, whatever. A lot of folks have come forward to say, well, that's my dad or my uncle or whatever. And I'm sure they're sincere on that, but it was all predicated on the belief that Capa landed on Fox Red section of the beach where their father or uncle or whoever landed. But Capa didn't, as we'll see, he landed on Easy Red. So that just can't be true. Again, we see the shaky cam blurred action image. Capa did not intend to land that day. He accidentally was kicked off of his landing craft. He was supposed to go back and take his photos with him on the landing craft. So I'm sure that the shaky cam here was probably well-earned and well-deserved near panic. All of his photos on the beach were taken looking offshore, none of them of the fighting onshore. And that, to me, indicates he was probably looking for a quick way off of the beach, get back where he needed to be.
Yeah, as I would have done.
Yeah, I mean, he had to get back quickly because the transports were going to start hauling craft up at 11 o'clock and head back to England. So he couldn't afford to spend any time on the beach. Upper right-hand corner is, that's good, is a landing craft infantry nosing in to debark. And go ahead into the next one, if you don't mind. There we go. Aboard that LCI was a Coast Guard cameraman named David Ruley, and he was a motion picture cameraman. And shortly after Capa took his photo, Ruley took a film clip of his LCI debarking troops, which you see on the right. And I've got little triangles and squares there to line up the obstacles to show that these are just reverse images. So here you are on this great big beach under fire, and you got two photographers essentially taking photos of each other at the same time. But the important thing to me on this is that, first of all, as the clip goes on, you see the crews or the loads of troops from two landing craft surging into view from the left. And they continue on moving up the beach, freely moving up, not in the ground. And behind tank dozer number 10, which is in the center there, is another dark mass. And you see that little chimney type thing, and that indicates it's a third DD tank. And it's slowly moving up the beach at crawling speed. And you see there's a good, 20 guys moving in behind it. So the narrative of being pinned down isn't quite realistic. And for the history nerds out there, you recall that one landing craft tank brought its 3 surviving DD tanks to the beach and debarked them. Well, we've seen 3 different DD tanks here, so they obviously landed here. And that means where Capa landed, there were 6 tanks in action to support the folks, which means these guys were exceptionally well supported by 75 millimeter guns as far as that end of the beach goes.
We had a comment from Rob Crane, and Rob Crane is the combined operations pilotage party's expert, been on the channel before, and he is saying, you know, is Capa standing up for this photo? And this again is where his description of what he did on the beach and his description of how everything came to pass doesn't necessarily correlate with your interpretations and other people's interpretations, you know, of exactly what's going on. You know, is the camera shaking because he's trying to get a great image, or is it shaking because he's a naturally scared human being? And this is part of the interesting thing. But do you think he's standing up at this time, or is he crouching? Because obviously that guy's low in the water there. Is it? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I've worked with Rob before. We've exchanged emails. He's a great guy and a true expert in his area. My belief is Capa is crouching down there behind dozer tank number 10.
Okay.
As a sane, non-soldier, non-combatant probably would be doing, taking cover.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant stuff.
Okay. Now, ironically, there was yet another cameraman there. The captain of the LCI 94 was a guy named Gene Gislason, and he was a shutterbug, and he had his own private camera and took a series of photos. And the LCI 94 had about halfway through its debarkation. The stern of the ship was being swept towards a mined obstacle. So he backed off, brought the craft in about 100 yards further to the west. And here it is at its second beaching site. And which ironically is just about where Capa was when he was taking his photos off the ramp of his landing craft. In the background, you can see just barely the 2 DD tanks in the left center, and then flanking them left and the right are the 2 waiting tanks. And the dozer tank is moved out of frame to the left. But the important thing to see here is that the 94 left the beach by 8:50, pardon me. And they're still debarking troops at this point. And note how high the tide has gotten in that time. Just to the left of the figures that have debarked, you see the 4 prongs of a hedgehog barely sticking out of the water. And the hedgehogs to the left and right of it are already completely submerged.
Yeah.
So that gives an idea how fast the tide was coming in. And every about 10, 11 minutes, the tide rose a full foot. And that'll bear on a couple of things you've got a little bit later on. So, okay. Now, I threw this one in there. This is not a Capa photo. All the Capa photos in this show are outlined in red. The ones outlined in blue are taken by somebody else. This is from Chief Photographer's mate Robert Sargent. Robert Sargent was a Coast Guard cameraman that was on board the USS Chase, which was the attack transport Capa came on. Sargent accompanied a wave that landed 40 minutes earlier than Capa.
Yeah.
And he landed in front of Resistance Nest 64, which is guarding the E1 exit.
Yeah.
And in fact, it was under earlier time and under much heavier fire. The company you see landing here lost about 40 guys just crossing the anti-tank ditch a little bit inland from this spot. This is one of 3 photos he took on the Two of them were on the approach into it. Sergeant was a U.S. Coast Guard, exactly right. They had a combat artist, a motion picture cameraman, which we'll cover here, as well as Sergeant. But anyhow, this is to me a great photo. First of all, it's technically much better under much worse combat conditions, and I just love that. But it also tells a great story. In the center, you've got it's tank dozer number 9 from Gap Assault Team number 9. And if you take a look at that, you don't see any obstacles there except for 1 or 2 shredded pieces of trash. Gap Assault Team 9 has opened their gap. And in fact, right on the shoreline to the left, you can see their rubber boat that they use to float in their spare demolitions. The other thing is that as the troops are wading in, you see they're deeper in the water. And that's because the beach had the transverse runnels that you'd hit a sandbar, you go 15 yards, and now you're back down in the hole. And finally, you notice how quickly the ramp's coming up. The ramp was armored, and so the crews like to get those things up as quick as possible.
Yeah.
And so you can imagine how when Capa was standing there fouling the ramp, taking his 5 photos, one of the crewmen went up there and, as Capa put it, booted him off the landing craft so they could get the hell out of there.
And I would just interrupt because I mean, I have that as my screen behind me for every World War II TV show I do, and I use that so often on tours because you can see so much in it. You know, the fact that the guy there's got one of the backpacks on with probably 6 satchel charges, something like that. The one just stepping off the ramp, they're loaded, and you can see the what I call the sandbars and the troughs of water there. It's so good for explaining the terrain of Omaha Beach if you take the time to just slow down and examine what you can see in that photo. And I think if you do, at first glance, it's a fantastic photo, but at a more in-depth look, it is very revealing about the exact situation and why the plan had some issues with it, and the fact it didn't understand the current, the easterly moving current, etc., etc. It's an amazing photo in so many ways.
Fun fact, the wave leader of this wave was a young man named Forstall, who was the son of the Secretary of the Navy.
Right. Brilliant stuff. Right. On we go.
Okay. The big question is where Capa landed and how do we know he landed there? The first person to really take a look at this that I think did a good job was a guy named Peter Jute, who's a Dutch tour guide and Dutch historian. He's got a great website out there too. And he analyzed it by looking at the terrain configuration, comparing photos back then to photos now. And he determined Capa landed between the exit E1 and E3 draws. And I didn't see anything wrong with his analysis. It's just that I wasn't convinced that with the changing vegetation that you could necessarily make that good of a judgment. So I took a look at it separately from a different point of view, looking only at contemporary photos. And this is a picture of something called the Roman ruins.
The Roman ruins. God, don't get me started on how that earned its name. Yeah. Anyway.
So you've got a couple buildings there. There are 2 buildings. You can't quite see them separately as 2. Partially destroyed by the Germans with a wall around them. And that's an important point because a boat section led by Lieutenant Spaulding landed and assaulted the bluffs right along that line right there. They were followed then by Company G, and between the 2 of them, they breached the bluffs and went on to make probably the first penetration on D-Day. Go to the next slide if you could, please. So that's just an establishing shot. Now this shot was one of 3 taken by a Lieutenant Bouchard on an LCI that landed later in the day. A lot of traffic came here because there was an open gap in the obstacles. And this is off the right side of his LCI, and you see again the Roman ruins. Now they don't appear quite the same here because the berm in the middle or in the foreground is actually kind of put about the lower half of the Roman ruins in defilade. So all you see is the top of that. If you move on to the next slide, please. Next slide is taken by the same man from the same LCI, and this time it's off to the left. And you see 2 DD tanks, 2 waiting tanks, and a DD tank off the left side. I've highlighted a bit of the skyline there. And go ahead to the next one, please. And this was also taken by Lieutenant Boucher, this time as his LCI was retracting and leaving. And on the bottom right, you see the two waiting tanks again. And this time, the DD tank is pulled up into the sandy portion of the berm, and it's gotten mired down in the sand, unfortunately. Now, I've highlighted another section of skyline there. And putting those two together and comparing them with the next slide, which is the slide we looked at earlier of Capa's, you see very distinctively, it's the exact same skyline segments of it. So that puts Capa's landing site just about 100 yards maybe to the east of the Roman ruins. And go ahead and move one more slide forward if you don't mind. Okay, so this comes from Omaha Beachhead, the Army's history of the landings. And this kind of lays out where we are. On the upper right, we have WN62, the resistance nest guarding the E3 draw. On the left, we have WN64 guarding the E1 draw. And the Roman ruins are highlighted at Capa's landing site. Now, that was the major penetration on D-Day. Later in the day, 9 more battalions would be landed to reinforce the landings. And 7 of those came up through that same penetration into the area. So this is really, in a key sense, the decisive point on Omaha Beach. Okay. Now I'm going to jump ahead a little bit here. This is Capa's on the LCI 94 as it's withdrawn. And he's taking a picture of the scene where he just came from. It's hard to tell, but down at the surf level, right at the berm, you see the collection of 5 tanks that we saw earlier.
Yep.
And you also see the 2 separate buildings of the Roman ruins. So all that conclusively proves that where Capa landed. And to give him credit, it directly confirms what Peter Ute had come up with. So congratulations and due credit to him for this.
Yeah.
Okay, now this is a key photo. This is Capa on the LCI 94. At this point, he's linked up with chief photographer's mate David Ruley, who let me forestall your man in the chat there. Yes, he was another Coast Guard cameraman. This story is full of coasties. Now you remember the photo that Captain or Lieutenant Gislason had taken of the folks debarking from his landing craft and how high the water was. So Capa supposedly, when he got aboard, he was neck deep in water. The water was, quote, slapping under his chin, and he was soaked. Well, he's looking pretty darn dry at this point. And also, when he boarded, right after he boarded, the ship was hit. And as he put it, he was covered in chicken feathers, which turned out to be kapok stuffing. Well, there's no kapok stuffing, there's no chicken feathers. So this kind of throws into question the timeline of how long he was on the beach. Let's go to the next slide here and see if we can't start addressing that. Okay, this is another clip from Ruley. This shows the damage from one of the shell hits that hit the craft. And we're on the boat deck now. You see the flag lockers at point A. Point C is the ladder up to the open con. Point D is the booby hatch that leads into the pilot house. And B shows that a bunch of fragmentation is smashed in there, flying from left to right. And so if you move on to the next slide, that's not the 94, but it's another LCI of the same class. And that shows approximately where this shell hit. Right there at the booby hatch, right next to the life raft, the Carly float, which also had kapok on it. So it could have been kapok either came from that or from the life vest or the crewman. So the next photo next clip that Ruley took showed the second shell hit. And there's a plug in the hole there now, but that's right at the edge of a porthole on the front side of the pilot house of the LCI 94. If you keep in mind that little vertical feature there just to the left of the porthole, you can see that on the next slide.
Hang on. Yep.
Okay, so that's on the front face of the landing craft. And so that gives us some clues about where the craft was when it was hit. And we'll go to the next slide to take a look at that. Capa says that right after he boarded, while he's still above decks, the ship was hit by enemy fire. And so the first hit would have been in the area marked A. We're not exactly sure if they were still touching ground at that point or they were in the process of withdrawing. We got a couple different crewmen that say different things, but it's clear the ship was in that orientation to get hit from one of the smaller caliber guns on WN-62, 47, 50 millimeter. There's varying reports on it. The two hits happened, quote, in quick succession. But you can see that the ship had changed aspects by point B in order to get generally facing that gun to be hit in the front side. So this happened in a very quick time. Now, after Capa was covered in chicken feathers, he went below decks. Okay, so not much time has passed between point A and B. Point B, the steerage had been shot out. Captain had ordered one of his guys, one of the bowmen, to get back to auxiliary steering. And by the time he got there, he found there was already another sailor there, and they'd switched to manual steering, and they got underway without delay. So there wasn't a whole lot of time between points B and C either. So what that means is Capa had virtually no time to get down into the engine room, dry off, pick off all the chicken feathers, and come back up at point C where he took that picture going away. So that indicates he couldn't have dried off and done all that in that very brief matter of maybe 3 to 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And that means he had to have boarded earlier. And I think that's when he got his way on, when the ship was at its first beaching site and had stopped debarking troops, and that he took the advantage there. And that would have given him 15, 20, maybe as much as 25 minutes in the engine room. Engine room was 120 degrees, according to the guys that were down there that day. They saw Capa come down. It's badly shaken. He was smoking a cigarette in both hands. They had 2 cigarettes going. But he was down there. But that indicates he spent enough time in there to largely dry out before he came up and could be seen in the photo. So once aboard LCI 94, the craft started heading on back. There's Richard Whalen, who is the authorized biographer of Capa, had woven a tale that Capa left on LCI 85, but that's a confusion over some incorrect details Capa rounded up into his story. On the way back to the transport area, they flagged down a landing craft from the USS Chase, because Capa needed to get back to the Chase. That's where the rest of his camera gear was. That's where the rest of his exposed film was, and the rest of his personal kit as well. So here's Capa in that landing craft. And in the foreground, we see the crew has kind of as an afterthought said, hey, let's get one of our wounded on this landing craft and get it over to a ship so you can get some treatment. So they're in the process of getting their wounded guy into a stretcher to load on the landing craft. Now, I'm going to kind of go back for a second. I mentioned that the presence of Coast Guard cameramen. From the time Capa boarded the ship in Weymouth Harbor, he was dogged by the presence of Coast Guard cameramen. They had 2 of them. One was Robert Sargent, still photographer, and the other one was Chief Photographer's mate Harold Whitwer. Yes, another coastie. And they were, all of them, the civilian correspondents and the military photographers were working off a set of guidelines from SHAFE that said, these are the photos we want at each little stage. Get a picture of this, get a picture of that. So they ended up having almost duplicate photos. They had their different twists on them, but they're almost duplicate photos all through the entire thing. Now, Capas have become enshrined in history because Life and Magnum have kept them all together and have promoted them as a complete set. The Coast Guardsmen, however, were lost to history. Their names were lost. They were not allowed to have byline credit by military standards. And there was nobody there to bring together and push their entire body of work. So their portfolios have kind of gone by the wayside. But in my mind, their work is in many cases equal to, if not better in some cases, than Capa's. And the following slides kind of show this.
And then just to interrupt, this is why we're so lucky with the British that the Army Film and Photographic Unit so regularly you get the names, or the name of the photographer or the name of the cameraman there, and the IWM still have all the information there, so you can be pretty certain that the footage was taken by this guy, and then you have the accounts of where the guy was or what unit he was attached to. And Stephen Fisher did his fantastic Sword Beat show about the attack on Weistram a couple of weeks ago, and it's all there. And we're grateful as historians that we have the American Signal Corps photos and the US Navy photos, and they're fantastic. We all use them, but rarely is there any credit. It's just a US Army photo, a US Army Signal Corps photo. And as you're saying there are talented, skilled photographers behind these images whose names have been sadly lost.
Yeah. I love the ID Imperial War Museum. Big fan of theirs. But anyhow, this is another thing. This is a briefing before they left Weymouth Harbor, and they're briefing the coxswains on the beach lanes, and the visual clues to guide themselves in. And on the left is a Capa photo, and taken from almost exactly the same spot, taken at almost exactly the same time as the film shot by Chief Whitworth. Move on to the next one too.
Yeah.
Okay, now this was back on LCI 94, and again, it demonstrates pretty much the same thing. The left two photos are photos Capa took of the crew trying to treat a young man named D'Annunzio, who was badly wounded. In fact, he passed away shortly after these photos were taken. This is taken on the boat deck of the LCI 94. On the right side, they're covered by the blanket. It's the area where the shrapnel was. The photos taken from the vantage point of the open con. Capa climbed up there to the open conning position. And on the right is a clip from David Ruley of the exact same scene, with mostly the same characters. They moved around a little bit. And his position is probably just a little bit to the left of Capa's. Now, small detail, I think it's probably seen better in Ruley's film, but just to the left of that little string of tape that's hanging down there, you see some white flecks. And those white flecks are the kapok that had been shattered and spread about, which Capa referred to. And well, where the hit was, Capa wasn't anywhere near that, so he wasn't covered in kapok at all. But again, the exaggeration, he always made his stories sound a little bit sexier than they were. But again, two cameramen, same images. Next slide, if you don't mind, please. Okay, now when he was waiting in the landing craft for the casualty came aboard, Capa was there to take a picture, and in this picture, the stretcher's just been passed down to the three crewmen in the landing craft, and you see them struggling with it. And on the right hand is a frame from a clip by Ruley of the same scene. This is the end of the clip, and you see Capa moving into frame from the left to come and grab one corner of the stretcher and help it down in. So again, step by step, the cameramen are taking photos of the same thing. And let's go to the next one to illustrate that again. We're now back at the chase, and the left-hand photo is a photo Capa took from within the landing craft as they're hoisting that stretcher out to the crew on the USS Chase. They've winched the landing craft up to the deck level. You see the little gangplank there that they're putting it across. The center photo shows the same landing craft being immediately reloaded with troops. They had more troops to land that day. And Capa took a picture of that scene at the beginning of loading there. And on the right, we have a photo by Sargent. Sargent had come back from his trip to the beach at that time, and he captured the exact same scene. And Capa's maybe, I guess you might call it more artistic with the backlighting on it, and it has a certain appeal. Sargent's is a little bit clearer and better for a historian's analysis. Whichever one you want, whichever one you prefer. All right, the next one. And so this continues for the rest of the day. Capa took, after he left the beach, he exposed 5 packets of 120 millimeter or 120 format film, which comes to 60 images. We have proofs of, I believe, about 34 of those. And the one on the left is another one of those photos. And we're now looking down at LCI 85, which had been badly damaged off of Fox Green Beach, and limped back and was alongside the chase, offloading wounded survivors and trying to get aid in fighting the flooding. And of course, on the right, we have a photo taken by a sergeant again of almost the exact same scene, same ship. Their photos are so similar that Capa's biographer, Richard Whalen, in some cases couldn't tell if it was Capa's photos or the Coast Guard's photos.
Wow. And it's just worth it. I know we're going to do the how the story developed, pun intended, in a minute, Chuck, but even when the Capa photos come up in kind of popular mythology, there's always this "the only photos of Omaha Beach that day" kind of tagline put on them. And as you've shown, there is a record of this whole story from that part of the beach alone by a series of photographers that, as you've been explaining so well, clearly show the history of what was happening, who was where, which ship was where, the movements of there. So just the language, the whole way the Robert Capa photos come up is always burdened with this mythology. It's, you know, the priceless, rare, the only shots. It's hyperbole in most cases. But yeah, great stuff, by the way. And Michael Ackerman has joined us in the sidebar. We must have said Omar enough times to summon him from below. So welcome aboard. I can't wait to spend June the 9th climbing through bunkers with you. It'll be really fantastic. So anyway, back to you, Chuck.
Anyhow, at this point, Capa's back on the chase. Things get delayed because of the problems unloading the beach, so the transports don't really leave until about 18:30 that evening, several hours later than they planned. They head on back to Weymouth Bay, and unfortunately for Capa, one of the other pool guys was in a ship at the lead of the convoy, and the convoy gets into Weymouth, and the other ship unloads first. So a photographer by the name of Bert Brandt, who is covering the 1/16th side of the beach, he gets his film back to London first, and so he's got this great scoop. And Capa is not really happy about this. He makes a snide comment about, well, you know, this other guy didn't even get out of his landing craft. You know, well, Capa wasn't supposed to have either, but and he's probably right. Bert Brandt probably didn't get out of his landing craft. He claims he did, but he has no photos of it. So, but Capa was very much disappointed. You know, up to this time, he'd never been hired on as a full-time photographer of the magazine. He was always working on retainer, and I'm sure he was disappointed that he thought his chance had been blown, but they hadn't. Life loved his photos, and they immediately offered him a full-time position on the staff. But the photos then get back to London, and that's where the great question goes. Capa was not in London, so he doesn't really know what happened there. He's told a month or two later that his film was lost. The initial thing from Life was that the film had been ruined by seawater. I don't know where they got that idea. And his captions were done by an editorial assistant back in New York. And so a lot of his captions were made up, made up in the sense of their understanding of what happened on the beach, as opposed to what was actually.
And as you said, they're using it as a means of explaining the whole story of Omaha, using the photos they happen to have to tell that story. So like when you read a newspaper article online, it says, you know, stock photo used for storytelling. It's what they've got. So they're using the photos to tell a wider story, which is fair enough. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with that as a concept. But here it starts to get interesting.
Yeah. Now I'm going to disagree with you just a little bit on that. See, Capa neglected to fill out any photo caption sheets to send in with this film, so the New York guys really had no idea what was
fair enough,
there, and they had to make that up. But on the other hand, you know, they were pushing their image, the brand, and so they placed him in the front in the leading wave of the attack. He never said at that point that he did. They had no way of doing it. He obviously did not. So they kind of pushed that angle because it's marketing. You know, we've got the best
Yeah.
photos, guy first on the scene.
Yeah.
And that set the tone. The first on the first wave with Company E, myth did not start with Capa. It started with the life captions. Now
Fair
Capa
enough.
embraced it because it did do a damn thing to hurt his image, but that did not start with him. And the lost film legend really didn't start with him either. That was kind of John Morris's period. John Morris was his photo editor in London, and he ran the lab. The lab had Brad Cock-Wild and an intern supposedly named Sanders or Banks, different name and different accounts. And that's when the story became that the film was ruined in a drying cabinet. Now, Morris was a great ally of Capa's. When Capa came back from Russia with the Russian Journal photo spread, which was almost a disaster, they're so dismayed by what they saw in Russia. It was Morris who then took the photos, and Morris was working at that time with Ladies' Home Journal and convinced the journal to run the photos and kind of made it a success. And he ended up as actually the business manager for one of the Capa's Magnum photo agency offices. So they were very tightly intertwined. And at that point, the film became Morris's story. And Morris had a very dramatized story about everybody's waiting for Capa's film. And I told the story about how it was ruined in the lab. And the fact is, we don't know what happened to the film. We can say a couple things. One is, it's almost positive he didn't have a second roll of film on D-Day from his 35 millimeter camera. He landed with his first exposure from his landing craft was exposure number 29. Now, where were the previous 28? Most probably taken on the way in to the beach, but we don't know that, and they've never surfaced. So the only lost film that we really have are those 28 photos before he got to the beach. He wasn't on the land long enough to expose a second roll of film. He never got to the embankment, the shingle embankment, like he claimed he did. So what happened to it? Well, a lot of his film is also missing from the trip across the channel. And all this film that is missing tends to be the kind of stuff that Schaaf didn't want really to get published at that time. This goes back to a censorship issue. The cover story still was that the Normandy landings were just a preliminary landing. Patton and his ghost army was going to land weeks or months later at Pas de Calais, and that was the real landing. So Schaaf had really throttled how much visual coverage of the invasion that made it out. Now, nowadays, you take a look at it, and you find thousands of images of the D-Day landings, but you couldn't at the time. All the photos went through a photo review board, which determined which ones were going to make it to the press quickly through radio telephone. And the ones that didn't were generally either because they showed way too much of the size of the invasion, or they just got there too late for the cycle and were never seen until historians started looking at them. When the film first came in, it didn't go to the agency. It went through the censors. And censors reviewed the caption notes to see what was on the film. If it said nothing significant, they'd send it to the lab to be developed, and then they'd review it for any minor things that needed to be edited. But Capa's came in with no caption notes, and it's from the actual assault. So according to their policies, that would have been placed in the hands of a custody officer who would have taken the film to the lab, cleared out everybody except the essential folks, and developed the film there, then take the film back to the censors for actual censorship. And I don't know, but my belief is that the censor just said, look, you're showing way too much of the size and strength of the invasion. So what they let through was a very narrow, infantryman's view of action, and everything else was wreck, ruin, and a failure. There's no sign of success on the beach evident to people. What do you see? We see the guys pinned down and stationary, and everything else is damaged ship, casualties, etc. The vast majority of his photos are of that ilk. So that's my take on it. Other people are welcome to their interpretation, but after looking at it for a lot of years and taking a look at the Schaef photo policies, that seems to be the most logical.
So there's a few. Thank you very much. Fantastic stuff. There's a few things I kind of want to unpack, and I think there'll be some comments from the viewers as well. And so this is where you kind of have a merging of different stories that sort of combine to add to this legend. Because earlier in the war, we've talked about it on the channel, they had some issues with more graphic photos than intended coming out of Tarawa and Peleliu and things like that that shocked the US nation, and they realized they can't kind of stop. They shouldn't hide the truth, because that's the German way is just denying the truth. You've got to tell the people can handle it to some extent, but managed. So as you're saying there, that there will be photos from the landings in Normandy, but they will be carefully selected so that they gave the right information to the folks back home, but not the wrong information. So we're not withholding the story from you. We're being careful which parts of the story that we're showing. And then the other story that gets merged in is the one you hear in normal time, is the dropped film bag over the side of the boat, which is another thing that gets, I don't even know where that one even starts there, but that kind of merges into the Robert Capa story as well, and the lost stuff. And then and so what, if I'm being clear, chat, what happened is there are absolutely shots taken that we don't know what happened to, but the assumption has been by some people that they were the shots taken from behind the obstacles on the beach there, behind the shingle, and there's some sort of conspiracy about the fact that it was those shots that were the ones that were troubling. They showed too many dead people or something, and that's why, and they're missing. But what you're saying is, and I think some of us knew this already, is that the shots missing are actually pre that moment, and they may or may not add more to our story, but they're not I was going to say smoking gun, but that's not the right kind of job. But they're not the sexy photos that people think are missing. That those photos aren't missing because they never existed.
You got two actual points there, and let me try to address them separately. Yeah,
please.
Schaef was giving out absolutely no information on their daily communiques. A lot of talk about bombings here, bombings there, but talk to ground stuff. They let nothing out. Life even had to mention in their 19 June issue, it was on the newsstands in 12 June. They said, they're talking about details of the landings. And they said the information we're bringing you is coming from German sources. Because we're not getting much. And so they really clamped down on how much was shown. They didn't want to give away the true side. Now, if you're a German fighting in Normandy, you knew this was the invasion. Okay. But back in the Führer's bunker, he's still under the delusion of the Pas de Calais landings coming up. So there's just a lot of winnowing that. The second one is about the lost film in the duffel bag. And I have a series of posts on Alan Coleman's site that addresses the lost film legend. And basically, I've been able to find film from every detachment that landed on D-Day. So there was no lost film as far as we can tell. The only stuff that there's question on is at Pont du Hoc. And we know that one of the cameramen there was killed coming in. And the other one, I believe, his camera equipment was ruined, and he ended up getting a Silver Star fight as an infantryman there.
Right.
But I was contacted by a lady the other day who's, well, actually, it's been about 12 months now, who was offended by my comment that if the film didn't make it out, it's probably just because the photo board didn't think it was significant enough to put on the wires. And she didn't like that. And she was very much convinced that her father said the film was lost but when it was all put in a duffel bag. Well, I was able to show that of the 6-man crew, we had film from 4 of those taken on D-Day, all making it into the archives. So I've got no idea what happened to her father's film. But yeah, there was no mass loss of film. All the film was there. And a guy who really pushed that was a guy named Doug Wood in a movie or a documentary, I think it was called Shooting War, and it profiled him. But Doug didn't land until a week or so after D-Day himself, so he wasn't there at that point. He was relaying secondhand comments. I'm sure he was sincere when he said that. He believed that, but yeah, it turns out not quite to be true.
So, for me, the million-dollar question here is, what impact has this story around the Capa photos had over the last 81 years on our understanding of Omaha? Has it had a negative effect? Has it had in some ways a positive effect? Because if you're discussing a subject, by definition, you're then aware of the subject. So the fact those Capa photos are so well known, people then have looked at Omaha Beach, and therefore what happened there, has it been a distraction from something else that's important? I mean, you're the US Army guy. What's the legacy? What has it done damage? Has it been interesting? What's your take?
Well, that's a difficult one. And it really depends on your view of the photographic arts. Now, there's a very strong argument to be made that the false impression that you get from those photos was actually relatively accurate for most of the fighting on the beach as a whole.
Yeah.
So you could call that as representative of the fighting on the beach, even though what you're actually seeing is not what you think you're seeing. And you're not going to erase that. These will forever be the images of that fighting. So has it done harm? As from a strictly historian's point of view, yeah, to me, I think so. It's been portrayed deceptively. But from the general reader of history's point of view, I think it's appropriate eye candy. Is that a good way of putting it?
Yeah. I mean, this is where we get into how many of the iconic photos from World War II have a slightly complicated backstory, in that they're not just there's someone, there's an image, click. I mean, the flag raising in Iwo Jima, we did that recently. The flag on the Reichstag, the St. Paul's Cathedral in London, the shot of the greengrocer in London with the still open despite the bombing. Although so many iconic photos. The Great War photo of the guy in the trench that they say is shell shock, the guy with a, but people said, well, he could just be laughing. Yeah, there are these certain images that have just become so ingrained, that have a bit of a history behind it. But does it really matter? I don't. It's fascinating, but I'm not sure I have an answer. If you'd given the question I gave you to me, I don't know that I've got an answer to it particularly.
The general moral, I think, the story that everyone should pay attention to, and that is that don't believe the caption. You know, if this doesn't speak for itself, the caption will speak for it. And whoever writes the caption, as in Capa's case, guy who wasn't there, knew nothing about what was going on, he just told to write a caption for it. You'll get a caption that quite often will mislead. Sometimes it's accidentally will mislead, and sometimes it's, well, we're going to twist this to push our brand and really make us look good. So it goes back to, don't necessarily believe everything the media tells you. Uses a skeptical eye. The problem is on military matters such as these, or things that only historical nerds are going to be into. That's kind of difficult, and the people are usually unfortunately left to having to believe the caption. And
this is where, like, when we were talking before going live and in the show about those hundreds of thousands of aerial photos that are now available, in high resolution, they were taken for in photo interpretation officers to gain information from that, to assist in planning operations. That they have a strict non-entertainment, non-storytelling reason for being taken. We're back to this idea, but it's not an idea. There's this notion of Robert Capa being an artist who is trying to record events, but he's also trying to put food on his table, because as you said there, he was only ever freelance. He's trying to record event, but he's also trying to get that perfect piece of art. He's he's got one foot in each camp. In the one half, he's working for the military to record the event for posterity, but on the other half, he's Van Gogh. He's he's trying to create an image, and that's the complication with photos like that differentiates them from like aerial photos that are for a purpose.
Yeah, nobody ever said Robert Capa was a technically a good photographer. Even his friends said, well, no, he wasn't technically very good, but he always managed to capture a good image. And the problem is sometimes the good image was a falsely constructed image. When he returned back to Normandy on D+2, was it? He took some pictures of some corpses on Omaha Beach. And actually, he took several photos. One of just the corpses, and then 3 different groups of individuals mournfully looking at the corpses. But he mixed and matched the people in them and took them from different angles and whatnot. So he's creating the scene of poor guys, grieving over their lost friends. So he would do that if he had the time. He would set up an image to portray something rather than just capturing something in the moment. And that still persists to coverage today. I remember watching at the beginning of the War on Terror early in Afghanistan. There was a reporter doing a live feed from up in the Northern Alliance area, and he's in a bombed out building, and he's claiming they're under shell fire. And every once in a while, you'd hear guns going off. Well, you were hearing artillery firing going out. He wasn't under fire. But the average viewer doesn't know that. They just thought, hey, I'm there in the middle of the action with the guy, and I feel connected to it. And so that's the little white lie kind of thing that you often see in the media coverage of things.
And this is, I was at the pub last night with a group of historians, one of my annual D-Day week gatherings, and one of the things we came up with or discussed was this idea of teaching people the art of critical thinking, the art of, as you said there, a caption may say something, but what is the caption really meant to be? How can we corroborate these things? How can we, as you've done with this show today, how can you say, okay, there are multiple photos of this particular sequence of events? What can we learn from that? And it's we've talked about on the channel before, the way the company commander, for example, discusses what he's just done to his battalion commander is not the same way he would write it home to his wife, because there's a different purpose behind it. Now, they're both true, but they're true from a different point of view. He's playing it down. Oh, fine, it was fine, dear. He says to the wife, yeah, no, I wasn't in any harm, etc., etc. And then the way he says it to the company commander is different. And then the way he might talk about it at a reunion 40 years later is different again, because there's maybe a certain sense of kind of chest puffing at that point, and you're with your mates, and there's a few beers flowing, and you're all telling your war stories. And so it's understanding why the piece of information was created in the first place. What was its purpose then? And therefore now, 81 years on, and understanding what that purpose was, and you having that information in our minds when we try and now assimilate that photo for something else. So when Mike Ackerman, and as you've done, studies these photos for the details, as you've pointed out, the bar, the curved marking on the engineer brigade helmet, that's not what the readers of Life magazine were wanting to take away from those photos. They couldn't give a shit about whether that guy is. They just want to see an emotional image of Omar. And I think we'll kind of close by the comment of Dennis, my friend Dennis, who's a journalist himself for many years. I think these images capture the essence of what occurred, if not necessarily the specific moment in time. And I think that's a very good way of summing up what someone like Robert Capa is doing. It's an essence of something, but not necessarily a scientific, accurate recording of something. Does that make sense? I think, doesn't it, Chuck?
It does, and I think in the context of D-Day, that's very, very, very true. It was on the beach, and did capture what was really going on at the beach, which is different, in my view, from the fallen soldier photo, which was completely staged. A lot of people argue, well, this shows the actual emotions of the moment. It's a real in that sense, and no, that's just plain staged. Kappas at the worst were misrepresented because of the claim of coming in early under fire,
Yep.
blah, 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 blah. But generally, it was accurate for what was going on 100 yards to the left and right.
Yeah. And then, we could go down a massive rabbit hole about the fact that him saying he was earlier than he was, or people saying he was earlier than he was, has become a thing. I mean, that when people now, the colloquial use of the word first wave is different to the strict historians' use of the word first wave. I mean, when I say first wave, literally that first band of 60 landing craft that are the assault waves of 16th Infantry, 116th. But there's a general acceptance that any time in the first hour and a half can sort of be counted as first wave in broad terms. I don't kind of agree with that, but I definitely acknowledge that that has been a sort of shifting of what is meant by that. And a D-Day veteran, even, we had this discussion at the pub last night, a D-Day veteran can technically be someone who came ashore a couple of days later, which it shouldn't be in the strictest sense. But we understand language does evolve and meanings of words evolve. And it's just, again, about the clarification and understanding what is meant by terms and accepting the fact that it can change. I mean, the example I always use is sometimes I'm English, sometimes I'm British, sometimes I'm European. It depends on what point I'm trying to make at a particular time. And all three are true, but they have different. I would use them for different reasons. But anyway, folks, we will leave it there. I'm going to hold up my copy of this book back into focus there, and there's much more information about the backstory than of course we could cover in the show today. Brilliant. I've had it met all the requirements I was hoping it was going to meet, Chuck. It's been fantastic talking to you, and yeah, brilliant stuff. So I can't wait to think of a reason to invite you back in the future. It's been a fantastic conversation. But folks, in the meantime, I'll be away, not doing anything for the next 2 or 3 days. Back June the 9th with James Donovan talking about the charge at Lafayette Bridge. So based on his new book. And then there's more shows. Steve Zaloga's coming on doing Carenton. We've got a show about the British 50th Division with Terry. Lots of stuff coming our way. But as I say, thank you for your comments, everybody. Thank you, Chuck. And I will see you all next time. Cheers, everybody. Bye.